Okay, great, go.
Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Professor Benjamin Smith. Professor Smith teaches Latin American history at the University of Warwick in England. He has written about 19th century and 20th century politics, land, indigenous groups, Catholicism, journalism, and the war on drugs. And today we will speak about his latest book, The Dope, the real story of the Mexican drug trade. Professor Smith, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's a delight. Thank you so much.
So my first question, I'm full of curiosity. You are all the way over there in the other side of the Atlantic. How do you become an expert on Latin American history, drug trade, guns, and all this and that from your ivory tower in England?
Well, first thing, if you've ever been to Warwick, it's very far from an ivory tower, but it's misnamed Warwick University, but in actual fact it's in Coventry, which was bombed to ruins during the Second World War. So it's not so much an ivory tower. But how did I get interested in Mexico? Well, effectively, I was a journalist in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I was a financial journalist actually. And
Mexico?
I went to Mexico in a vain attempt to become a stringer for the Financial Times. I was immediately sacked for basically being terrible. And then I ended up washed up, as many travelers do, as teaching English down in the southern state of Oaxaca. And I kind of fell in love with Mexico and fell in love with the place, and eventually married somebody from there, and now have an enormous cacophonous family of Latinos that I'm very close to. I spend a lot of my time in Mexico. One of my kids was born there. So now I feel very kind of attached to the country. And over the last 20 years or so, I've been studying it at Cambridge first, where I did my PhD. I then actually did go off and work in Michigan for a while, so near your kind of colder climes, but you're much hardier than me because I couldn't survive there, and certainly not my Mexican wife couldn't survive there. So we returned eventually to Warwick. I should say for the good weather, but that would be a lie. This is a very rare sunny day in Warwick. So that's kind of how I got into that. If you want me to talk more, I can talk about how I got interested in the drug trade.
Yes, just one a question about you teaching English. In some places, English teachers get paid more for teaching English from England as opposed to English from the States. I wonder what was
I never got that markup. I think they were taking that money from me. I now feel like I was hard done by. No, it was a very, very low grade English teacher in a kind of small private school. And I don't feel I got a markup, although obviously British English is far more respectable.
Well,
we'll allow the Canadians as well.
Fair enough. People in Mexico want to learn English to go to the States, not necessarily to England. So I get that. Okay, so yes, how you became interested in the drug trade?
Well, I suppose living in Mexico and having family in Mexico, it was kind of difficult to avoid post 2006, when the then president Felipe Calderon kind of announced a very aggressive militarized war on drugs. And it was difficult to miss, both in the news, but also on the streets. Much more police, much more army, many more checkpoints. But I think where it really struck me, the level of violence and the way that it was affecting all parts of the country, not simply parts of the country that was necessarily border trafficking routes or growing areas, was when an armed group called the Zetas effectively shot the owner of my local pub in Oaxaca City, basically for not paying them extortion money in the early 2010s. And it really brought home to me, and this was the place that I visited a couple of nights every week. I chatted to the guy. I knew him quite well. He would always kind of welcome me with a mezcal when I entered after being away, and they murdered him for not paying extortion money. So I realized that what I think thought was simply a war on drugs had extended into a much more complex war of organized crime in Mexico.
Wow. Not too long ago, I went to Acapulco and I was surprised to see the amount of soldiers with guns, with machine guns in practically every corner of the city. I mean, it was reassuring and frightening at the same time.
Yes, I mean Acapulco is now one of the most dangerous cities on earth. As a tourist, you rarely see this because the vast majority of murders happen in the poorer barrios up in the hills, or if they do happen in the richer tourist areas, then the bodies are dragged up the hills into the poorer barrios, so they don't affect tourism. So I mean, Acapulco has a kind of murder rate, I believe, of over 100 per 100,000. It's the same as Tijuana or Caracas. So it's one of the most murderous cities on earth, or it certainly was a couple of years ago. It's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the state it's in and the area around it has since the 1960s been the absolute key opium growing area of Mexico. It produces the best quality opium. About twice as good as anywhere else in Mexico, twice as strong. And it's grown by peasants up in the mountains and then transported, mostly made in kind of prefab heroin labs into heroin and then shipped up to the United States. So you've got a massive opium business there. Secondly, Acapulco now is a big drug market, right? People sell a lot of drugs there to tourists, to holidaymakers. And this has meant that small gangs have been fighting over control of this drug market. But unfortunately, these gangs have moved beyond the drug market to try and control kidnapping, control extortion, control rural businesses like the avocado trade and the logging trade and, the trade in people who grow coconuts. So this is expanded out from the drug trade. So that's why you saw so many soldiers on the street. So another thing that I do, and I kind of mention in the book, is I spend a lot of time dealing with refugees who are fleeing violence in Mexico. And around half of them are fleeing from around Acapulco. Wow. And fleeing from terrible violence and terrible displacement by these criminal groups that just roll into villages and extort money from people. And if you don't pay, you get shot.
Right. Well, you break your book in 5 sections, and the first section is 1910 to 1940. And you also claim that at one time in history, the drug trade was a peaceful industry. So I have a hard time visualizing that. Can you tell us how it was a peaceful industry at one time in history?
Yes, certainly. So really up to the 1970s, so before there was an aggressive militarized war on drugs, the drug trade was organized basically by family units, and it was very small scale. It was normally grown by some peasant members of the family up in the hills. It was then transported down the hills and processed into heroin, and then given to other relatives who would transport it up to the United States. So the vast majority of what we now call cartels were effectively family commercial businesses. So there was very little violence between people in these groups. They were linked by family, by marriage, by friendship, by parties. They went to the same parties, they went to the same weddings, they were godparents of each other's kids. So there was very, very little violence between them. And at the same time, as there was not a militarized war on drugs, there was very little violence between them and the state. So as I say, up to the 1970s, rarely any drug killings in Mexico. I mean, now people talk of 20,000 a year, but nothing like that at the time.
So it was in part the war on drugs initiated in the States that initiated also this violence all over Mexico as well?
So that's my opinion, yes. So I mean, part of the argument of the book is that the aggression of the war on drugs post 1970 effectively breaks apart these family-run businesses and turns drug traffickers against one another. Because in order to prosecute drug traffickers, you need informants within the drug trafficking organizations. So this basically creates a mass paranoia within the drug trafficking organizations. At the same time, up to 1970, if you got busted with a bit of heroin, you got 2 years inside, 3 years inside tops. By 1975, you were getting 15 years inside. So you were very, very reluctant to go to prison. And as a result, you were probably prepared to kill somebody who you suspected of being an informant. So that is one cause of the violence, is the kind of aggression of the war on drugs. The second cause, which I think is kind of slightly misunderstood, is Mexico has a history, or the Mexican government has a history, of extorting money from drug traffickers. And to do that, the government has been pretty violent, because people simply won't pay up unless you threaten them, either with time in jail or, as the Mexican authorities did, with torture. So one thing that I think really surprised me during the 1970s, 1980s, and I think to the present day, was how much violence was meted out by the Mexican police to extort money out of the traffickers.
Wow. I'm from
And I
Colombia.
think that's another. Yeah, sorry, go on.
I'm from Colombia, and we have our own war on drugs over there. We, I guess, Colombia is known as a producer of cocaine. And to my understanding, Colombians use Mexico as a gateway to the United States. I wonder, what can you share about the drug traffic of Mexico in relation to Colombia?
Yes, certainly. So I think this is not terribly well understood, partly because we have up to I wrote this book, actually, I think we had very little information on the kind of early years of the Mexican stage of the cocaine industry. But starting, it seems, in as early as the late 1960s, Mexican traffickers, particularly from a place called Culiacan, which is a city in northwestern Mexico and is still the center of the drug trade. It's where Chapo Guzman comes from. So starting in the late 1960s, certain Mexican drug traffickers realized there was a growing market on the West Coast for cocaine, and started to import not simply cocaine into Mexico, but even coca base, which they were then transforming into cocaine in their own former heroin laboratories. So it's much more sophisticated and much earlier, I think, than we give it credit for. We imagine that really Mexico gets into the cocaine industry in the 1990s, but it was there in the late 1960s. One of the biggest drug traffickers of the time, a guy called Eduardo Lalo Fernandez. The story goes, I heard that one of his daughters basically married into a Colombian military family. And that gave him connections in Colombia, which meant that he could get coca base that he then transformed into cocaine. So in the mid 1970s, he was probably transporting about 30% of the US's cocaine. Now, this clearly does take off when the American market for cocaine really takes off in the early 1980s. So as soon as crack becomes the popular form of cocaine, Mexico really moves into the market, and it becomes the dominant drug that Mexico is transporting. By the 1990s, and I thought this was extraordinary, America is taking 70% of the world's cocaine, and Mexico is transporting 90% of that. So it kind of dominates the market.
Well, what confused me a lot is why is the American market such a big consumer of drugs? I mean, the Mexicans have as much access to the same drugs as the US, maybe a lot cheaper, yet the ratio of consumption in the US versus the ratio of consumption in Mexico or in my country, Colombia, I mean, I don't know that many cocaine users in my country, Colombia. Wow, I go to a party in the US and, there's a little corner of people using cocaine, and that's extraordinary. Do you have any theories on why?
I mean, I think this goes back hundreds of years. So one thing I remember when I was researching in the United States, in the 19th century, America drank more hard liquor than anywhere on earth. And the British are pretty big fans of hard liquor, but they were drinking about twice as much per man, woman, and child as the British even. So there's always been a kind of attraction towards narcotics among the US populace. So I think one of the best works on this is a guy called David Courtwright, who's written about this as expert on kind of narcotics. And he links the taking of narcotics to basically capitalism. The harder you work, the more you need relief from that work. I mean, America is a place with only 2 weeks holiday per year, where people work on average incredibly hard hours. And as a result, many of them kind of wind down by taking some kind of narcotic release, whether it be alcohol in the 19th century, cigarettes in the early 20th century, or now marijuana in the early 21st century. So it certainly is linked in a certain way to kind of the performance of and relief from capitalism. Another thing that I think is important to bear in mind today is that America, despite having a kind of hard work culture, also has incredibly poor social medicine and virtually no psychological care for anyone who isn't in the upper middle class or above. Now, as a result, many people effectively self-medicate with narcotics. So if you're in the America's burgeoning underclass, you're deemed a kind of pernicious drug addict, but what you are is basically in pain, either psychologically or medically, and that's why you're taking drugs. And America has failed to come to terms with how to deal with these people, so they take narcotics. And I mean, you probably know the figures, but 100,000 Americans died of narcotic overdoses last year. I mean, that's extraordinary. It's like wiping out effectively the city I live in a single year. It's absolutely mind-numbing. I mean, in the book, I talk about the 1970s when the Americans got very worried about heroin overdoses. There were only 1,500 people died in 1975 of heroin doses. So now around 100,000 die per year.
And now we got all these kind of drugs homemade in the States as well, and all the legal drugs made created by the pharmaceuticals as well.
Well, this is something which America again is starting to come to terms with certain legal cases, although not terribly successful legal cases against some of these pharmaceutical companies. But what America is suffering now is effectively 3 epidemics at once. First of all, you have the legal opiate epidemic, the OxyContin epidemic. So loads of people who had a bad back or had some kind of injury and were prescribed OxyContin, which they got addicted to. Then, when that was made much more difficult to get hold of in the early 2000s, they took to heroin, and the Mexicans provided a lot of that heroin, as is told very well in a book by Sam Quinones called Dreamland. And then the third epidemic is fentanyl, which is a synthetic form of heroin that's about 50 times as strong. Now, that's what's killing the people now. That's what's killing 100,000 people. So you've got these 3 waves of effective opiate addiction, which has just gone through America's both poor and middle class and even the rich. I mean, a lot of the kind of famous stars of the last decade or so have died in overdoses which have been linked to fentanyl. Prince, for example, Tom Petty.
Okay, well, the drug landscape is changing fast. I mean, we have many states in the United States that are legalizing marijuana, which is a star. I wonder where is Mexico in regards to the legalization of marijuana and other drugs?
So it has recently passed a law which has effectively legalized marijuana. There is now an enormous amount of discussion about who gets to grow marijuana. But I think that is a step forward, but I think it might be a much less impressive step forward than we think. And as I point out at the end of the book, a lot of the violence that is happening in Mexico today is not really about drugs, right? So there have been, 20,000 deaths per year in Mexico connected to the drug trade. But the amount of drugs entering the US has never gone down. In actual fact, it's gone up over the last 15 years. So a lot of criminal groups have turned to other forms of crime. And they've turned to forms of extortion and kidnapping and shaking down legal businesses, as I say, expensive legal businesses, mining, logging, the avocado business. So who's to say that the legal marijuana business wouldn't just be shaken down by these criminal groups anyway? So there's a fundamental problem with security in Mexico and with governance, more than necessarily just with the drug trade.
Right. Here in Canada, we legalize marijuana, and a lot of people were predicting the doom of society. And in fact, nothing different has happened. In fact, when I compare smoking marijuana to drinking a glass of whiskey, I just don't see the difference. In fact, comparing alcohol and something as marijuana, I just don't see how it was ever illegal to smoke marijuana.
No, I mean, I kind of bring it out in the book. I mean, one thing that I found quite surprising, and frankly, this research was done mostly by a colleague of mine called Isaac Campos, is many of the ideas that we have, or many of the ideas maybe our grandparents or our parents have about marijuana, i.e. it causes violence, it causes people to behave in a completely irrational and violent fashion. These ideas, yes, they were popularized in America starting in the 1930s, but what I found extraordinary is they came from Mexico. Right, particularly during the kind of 1890s, 1900s, doctors and journalists and policymakers in Mexico started to connect smoking weed with acts of violence. Why was this? Basically because poor people smoked it and they needed a stick to beat the poor people and put them in prison. And that's what they did. So I find that kind of extraordinary how these ideas, these frankly completely mistaken ideas, travel from country to country, right? They just get adopted by the Americans, who find themselves with lots of Mexican Americans in the country and think, oh, we'll use the same rhetoric to have a go at them. And then those ideas are then transferred really over to Europe as well during the 1960s, when some Europeans start smoking marijuana.
Well, you just painted a very gloomy picture in regards to the criminal organizations in Mexico that, even if a product is legal, they just move in, like the avocado, which I had a hard time believing that there was an avocado cartel in Mexico.
Yeah.
But what's the future? I mean, is everything dark and oblique, or is there a light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, I think the move towards legalization marijuana is one step on the road. Now, whether this will be that then we will see the legalization and decriminalization of other drugs like we have in Portugal, for example. I mean, that is a possible future. I also think that the current president of Mexico, AMLO, his instincts are right. He is trying not to fight an aggressive militarized war on drugs, and he is trying to offer economic and social opportunities for the reams of poor young men and women who are living in areas and attracted to working for the cartels. This is a pretty long-term, both of these are fairly long-term policies. So to measure their success now is quite difficult. At the moment, it doesn't seem like it's working, but I think, as I say, his instincts are in the right direction. At least we're not fighting this pointless, aggressive war on drugs in Mexico anymore. But it is quite difficult to be optimistic, particularly when I'm dealing, I have to say, on a day-to-day basis with refugees who are fleeing from absolutely horrendous violence. That is very difficult to hear about and talk about with these people. But the amount of suffering that they've gone through definitely does make you fairly bleak about the future, unfortunately. So sorry about that.
Okay, well, you are an expert on Mexico, but it's hard to speak about Mexico without speaking about the United States. Do you have any insights of what's Biden policy or approach towards the drug trade in Mexico? Is he taking any kind of action or inaction?
It's a really good question. I think we're basically still waiting. So what effectively happened during the Trump era was quite interesting. Mexico had 2 years of breathing space because Trump wasn't really actually, despite his rhetoric, interested in the drug trade. He was interested in Mexico catching Central American migrants going through the country. And as long as Mexico caught Central American migrants, which frankly it did, then Trump was fine. Now, Biden has come to power and has certainly decreased the amount of pressure on Mexico to catch Central American migrants, although not entirely. So the question is he and people in his administration, and particularly the DEA, going to start putting more pressure on Mexico to crack down on drug dealers? So I think what happened, and I'm not sure if you followed this, but in summer last year, the DEA arrested a very, very high up Mexican military general who happened to be in Los Angeles. And they claimed he was heavily corrupt, and they released telephone transcripts which seemed to indicate he was taking money from traffickers. Now, this was, he was head of the military in Mexico in the previous presidency. And the DEA let him off. Now, and he returned to Mexico and was given basically a pass by the current president. So was this the DEA attempting to pressure the incoming Biden administration to put more pressure on Mexico? Did it work? Is Biden going to put more pressure on Mexico? I think these are questions that are still not yet answered, and we don't know. And as I say, COVID has kind of, in a way, got in the way of any formal, coherent policy the US might have on drugs in Mexico.
Well, Professor Smith, I think your book is extremely interesting and give you a historic perspective of the drug trade, and it just places it just give us a window of where this may end up. So I appreciate it very much. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow you?
Yeah, certainly. So it's called The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade. You can go to www.thedope.co.uk, which is my website, or you can get it on any other, in your local bookshop, or anything like that, or you can follow me on Twitter. Just look up Benjamin Smith Drugs.
Okay, all the links will be in the show notes. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Cheers.